What's up guys, Asian here with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Templar DPS. This is going to be a ranged Magplar build, so we're not going to be using sweeps as our main spammable here. Instead we'll be using Force Pulse or Crushing Shock with an Asylum Staff as our primary means of attacking. So this is a ranged Magplar build, so this is able to fulfill that sort of ranged Magicka DPS slot in any of your raid guilds, so you don't have to play the stereotypical Nightblade or Sork. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over gear, skill bar, CP point distributions, as well as attribute points, race. We're going to talk about our rotation, kind of what skills we want to prioritize, and then we will finish things off with a 6 million dummy rotation so you guys can see what the rotation looks like, as well as what kind of DPS you can expect to see if you're using this build. So starting off things first with gear. For our monster helm set, we will be using Zaan. Zaan is currently the strongest monster helm in the game right now, for Magicka DPS at least. However, it is pretty much a melee set. You have to be within 10 meters of the enemy in order for this Zaan to work. So if you are going to be further away from the enemy, for example, if you're moving around a lot, or if the boss is moving around a lot, then Zaan obviously isn't going to be nearly as strong. So Zaan will be very powerful in trials such as Vet Kraglin trials, and some of the bosses in Vhof will basically be stacking and burning on the bosses, and you're going to be within 10 meters from the boss at all times. So that's where Zaan becomes very powerful. Now, if you are moving around a lot, if the boss is moving around a lot, or if you have to play actual range DPS, for example, if you are the spear team in Manticora, for instance, then you're not going to want to use Zaan because you're not going to be able to make the most use out of it. Instead, you'll be using something like Ilambris or Skoria. I would actually prefer Skoria over Ilambris, but that's kind of up to you how you want to deal with it. Just because Ilambris, you don't really, for this build at least, you don't get the lightning proc, so you basically are cutting the potential of Ilambris in half. So Skoria will actually pull a little bit ahead, or about equal to Ilambris in that regard. Skoria is fairly decent on a Magicka Templar, even on as a ranged Magicka Templar, because you do have plenty of dots down, but it will, like I said, kind of pull about even with Ilambris. Ilambris does pull slightly ahead. I believe I said it the other way around a little bit earlier, but Ilambris does pull slightly ahead of Skoria, even though you aren't getting the lightning proc. For our 5-piece, we will be using Julianos. Still a very strong set, still probably one of the best sets to use for all Magicka DPS. It is a 6-trait crafted set from Hrothgar, so you will need access to the Hrothgar DLC or know somebody with access to the Hrothgar DLC in order to craft it. It's just a very easy set to get. You can pretty much don't have to farm for any pieces. You can get it all in Divines. You can use whatever weight you want, so you can play around with the weights of your Julianos piece. I have a heavy chest here, but it kind of depends on the RNG factor of which shoulders you get and which helm you get from your Undaunted chest. So that's kind of it. So now you do have other options when it comes to sets instead of Julianos. Because Magplars do have a little bit more fire damage compared to other classes, Burning Spellweave is actually not a bad choice either. This comes from City of Ash 1 or 2, but it does require some farming, and it only comes in light, so if you are going to be using Burning Spellweave, then you will need a medium and heavy Monster Helm set. You're going to need one of each, so you manage to maintain that 5-1-1 setup. Because you do have to farm for Burning Spellweave, Julianos is what I will recommend here. Burning Spellweave does pull just a little bit higher than Julianos in my testing. It's kind of inconsistent, but Burning Spellweave does on average pull a little bit higher than Julianos when you do manage to get more than 58% uptime on the proc. But Julianos does pull pretty close to Burning Spellweave, mainly because of the 2 spell crit bonuses from Julianos, kind of helping out the Magplars, because Magplars do have additional crit damage, so the additional spell crit does help out Julianos catch up with Burning Spellweave. So our second piece, or jewelry specifically, is going to be Master Architect. You can use any of the minor Slayer sets. I have one Magicka regen glyph with 2 spell damage glyphs, but you can go with 3 spell damage if you'd like. I just like having that additional regen, especially for a Force Pulse build like this. Your sustain is going to be worse compared to a Magplar that's using sweeps. So having that additional regen really helps out your DPS. I can actually finish an entire 6 mil dummy with 1 heavy attack every other blockade, so it's actually really nice to have that regen glyph there. For our front bar, we're going with an Asylum's Perfected Inferno Staff infused with a fire damage enchant. You can go with an Absorb Magicka enchant if you feel you need a little bit more sustain, because that does help out your sustain a little bit. But that's kind of up to you if you want to use Absorb Magicka or not. I like to stick with the fire damage enchant with a regen glyph. I feel like that's a fair trade-off in terms of DPS. Now, if you don't have a Perfected Inferno Staff, you can go with just a normal, non-perfect staff. You just have to make sure it's still infused with the same flame damage or Absorb Magicka enchant. If you don't have an Asylum Imperfect Staff, but you do have one of the Minor Slayer sets, Inferno Staves, then go ahead and use one of the Minor Slayer Inferno Staves instead. If you don't have any of the Inferno Staves for Minor Slayer, what you can do instead, you can also replace Master Architect with Willpower instead, and then just use something like a Julianos Inferno Staff here. So it's kind of up to you how you want to play around with that. And for our back bar, we're going with the Maelstrom Inferno Staff infused with the weapon damage enchant. Not much explaining to do here. We're seeing a shift away from lightning staves to Inferno stave back bars because of the changes to off balance. So we're going to go with infused with a weapon damage enchant. Alright. For our character sheet here, we are a Dark Elf because we are using double Inferno Staves. Dark Elves are going to be the best race for Templars, but you can use any of the other magically inclined races as well. So you can go with the High Elves, the Altmer, the Bretons, or you can go with Argonians. Argonians do have some extra sustain with their potion passive, but they will pull generally lower DPS than the other 3 choices. If you want to min-max though, Dunmers, the Dark Elves, are going to be the best choice for you. For our attribute points, we have all of our points into Magicka, but do keep in mind that if you are feeling a little bit lack of survivability here, we are using Witchmothers with a health enchant, so you do have to kind of keep that in mind. You have lower health than most other Magicka DPS if you're not using blue food, max health, max Magicka food. So you can put a couple of points out of Magicka into health if you feel like you need that additional survivability. That's kind of up to you. As for Mundus Stones, we're going with the Apprentice for this build, but you can go with the Lover as long as you are not over the penetration cap by too much. Remember, the penetration cap is 18,200. If you're over by about 100 or 200, it's not that big of a deal, but if you're going over more than like 300 or 400, I would probably swap over to the Apprentice, but and it depends on your group, the amount of debuffs you get. If you're having Alkosh with Infused Thorax Crusher, when Alkosh is up, you will be over-penetrating with the Lover by a very large margin. I think it's like 1.5k or something like that, or 2k. So in that case, you do want to use the Apprentice. Otherwise, if you only have Thorax Infused Crusher, then the Lover might not be a bad choice in terms of Mundus Stone. And we are using Witchmother's Potent Brew, so we do have lower health compared to if we were not using blue food, which is just max health, max Magicka. So we do need a health enchant on one of our armor pieces if we are using Zaan or Ilambris. If you're using Skoria, you can go with all Magicka enchants because the one piece of Skoria does give you additional health. You can use also, there is a gold level food, a legendary food that comes from Clockwork City, which is basically an upgraded version of Witchmother's with some added health regen as well. That is the best food to use. However, it is a gold food, so it does use perfect row, so it is fairly expensive to make and to buy. So don't feel like you have to use it. I use Witchmothers for most of my content, except for progression content, for example, VMAW, VHOF, and VAS hard mode. That's where I'm going to use gold food. So you can kind of play around with that however you'd like. And now on to skills. For our front bar here, we have Crushing Shock. You can use Force Pulse for some more DPS, but I like the Interrupt from Crushing Shock. I find it very useful to have. Vampire's Bane, Purifying Light, Radiant Oppression, Inner Light, and Empowering Sweep. We will not be using Empowering Sweep as our damaging ultimate. Empowering Sweeps is just here, so we have our passive from Adric's Spear line, Piercing Spear, which increases the amount of critical damage done, but we need to have an Adric's Spear ability slotted, so we have Crescent Empowering Sweep as our ultimate here. We're in terms of Vampire's Bane, so you can go with the other morph, which is Reflective Light if you'd like. Vampire's Bane is generally pulls a little bit higher single target DPS, but Reflective Light will give you a little bit more cleave. It's kind of however you want to play it. I prefer Vampire's Bane, but again, it's kind of up to you. Reflective Light kind of fits into the rotation a little bit better compared to Vampire's Bane, just because of the duration, but Vampire's Bane does deal more single target DPS. For our back bar, Blazing Spear, Blockade of Fire, Channeled Focus. This is where you would actually put your shield here. So you can go with either morph, Dampen Magic, or Harness Magic. Dampen Magic will give you a larger shield, and Harness Magic will give you better sustain as long as you are hit by those spell projectiles while you have the shield up, so you can kind of pick and choose whatever you'd like. I personally like to go with Dampen Magic just for the additional shields, because if non-Sorc Magicka DPS do tend to have smaller shields compared to Sorcs, so having Dampen Magic kind of closes that gap a little bit and improves your survivability. I prefer to have more survivability and heavy attack a little bit more often compared to having a lower survivability with a little bit better regen. We have Inner Light again, and then our ultimate here, you kind of have two options here. You can go with Shooting Star like I have here, or you can go with the Destruction Staff ultimate, Elemental Rage. It's kind of up to you, however you want to play it. Elemental Rage is better for trash pulls, and Shooting Star is a little bit better for single target DPS. Don't forget that with Shooting Star you also get 2% additional Magicka and Magicka regen while on your back bar, so that does help out a little bit if you decide to swap where you have your shield and Radiant Oppression, because some people do like to have their shield on the front bar and keep Radiant Oppression on your back bar. It's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. Because you have two Inferno staves, doesn't really matter too much which slot you have Radiant Oppression and your shield on. So for instance, I have my shield on my back bar for right now, but sometimes I put it on my front bar if I need to bring my Magplar for progression runs, just because I'm going to be on my front bar more, so being able to shield while on my front bar is more important than having that Radiant Oppression there. So again, pick and choose. If for boss fights, I would go with Shooting Star, but if you do have ads you need to cleave, then go with Elemental Rage. Now for our CP point distribution, we have 240 points now that Dragon Bones is out. 75 in Arcana, 75 in Tenacity, which leaves 40 more points, which you can kind of put into these next three nodes however you'd like, or really any node really on any of the trees here. I have 31 in Shadow Ward, 28 into Tumbling, and 31 into Warlord. I prefer a balanced approach there. And that just helps conserve stamina for when I do have to block cast or use Break Free, for example if I'm progressing through VHOF or something like that. For our blue CPs, this is kind of where I need to give you guys a little bit of a disclaimer here. This particular CP setup is optimized for a Torag's Infused Crusher group, so you only get Torag's Infused Crusher. You don't get Alkosh. So I am have a lot of points in the spell erosion compared to if groups are running Alkosh. So ever since the synergy changes have gone live, Alkosh has kind of been on the lips of a lot of guilds now that synergy is a lot easier to activate. Alkosh still kind of has the problem of when it's not up, you're dealing less damage overall, so kind of play around with that and talk with your raid group, kind of figure out if you're going to be using Alkosh or not. What I recommend doing is just doing a raid parse, like Storm Atrio, maybe not Storm Atrio, Valario for instance in VAA. Save that parse and use constellations to figure out what your optimal CP point distribution is. Now you do need to set the spell penetration manually yourself because it doesn't import that from Comet Metrics. There is currently a beta of Comet Metrics out right now that does give you average spell penetration, but Constellations has not been updated yet in order to pull that penetration value out of the report. So for right now, you do have to manually input your spell penetration for each parse that you do. So this is the distribution that I was given. So I have 39 into Spell Erosion, 40 into Elfborn, 64 into Elemental Expert, 9 into Staff Expert, 48 into Master at Arms, and 40 into Thaumaturge. And now finally for our red CPs, I like to take a one size fits most scenarios in terms of my distributions, but you can play around with them depending on your content. For example, if you're going with VMAW, where you're taking more magic damage compared to physical damage, you might want to take points out of Hardy and put them into Elemental Defender instead. Or if you're doing something like VAS hard mode, which again has more magic damage, you're going to want to put more points into Elemental Defender and Ironclad instead of Thick Skin and Hardy. I have 48 into Ironclad, 48 into Thick Skin, 1 into Light Armor Focus, 56 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and 31 into Bastion. Now I have the 31 points into Bastion both to help out my shield strength and as well as for the infusion passive. Magicka DPS generally are the ones who are rezzing people because they have access to a shield. So they can just pop their shield and then start rezzing somebody. So it's nice to have that additional Magicka regen when you do res your friends, especially if they're a Magicka DPS or a healer, because the extra regen will definitely help them get their resources back faster that way. Alright, so that's pretty much it in terms of the build. Now let's go ahead and talk about our rotation. So we're going to go over here to this 3 mil dummy so I can kind of show you guys what the rotation looks like here. Now for a Magplar, your rotation is kind of dynamic. Eventually it does come loop back around. I believe it is every 3 blockades it kind of loops back around, but it is sort of dynamic because of the way Vampire's Bane duration works. Vampire's Bane has about a 12-second duration, and then Blockade and Spear both have an 8-second duration, and I believe Purifying Light has a 6-second duration. Yes, 6-second duration. So they are kind of wonky here and there. So it is sort of dynamic. So basically what you want to do is you want to make sure to have your channel focus up. Now this lasts for 18 seconds, the actual rune itself, but if you step out of the rune, you still maintain the resistance buff as well as the additional Magicka regen buff for 8 seconds after you leave the rune. So if you go ahead and leave the rune here, you can see I'm still gaining Magicka back even after I leave the rune there. So you want to make sure to keep this rune up as much as you can. It gives you your major ward, major resolve buffs, so let's give you additional survivability here. So take a look here. You can see we have major ward and major resolve, and that really helps out our survivability, as well as our sustain because of that additional Magicka regen. So try to make sure you have your focused rune down up at all times. So now for rotation, it's basically you lay down your back bar dots. You're obviously going to start off with an ultimate, drink a potion, swoop to your front bar, and then put down Vampire's Bane, Purifying Light, and just continue on this way. And basically you just want to keep an eye on Vampire's Bane. Now I like to heavy attack every other blockade. When I first am starting off, I'll wait until the 3rd blockade, but afterwards I will always do it on the 2nd blockade. This just lines up well with when I have to put down my rune again after it disappears. That's the reason why I do it every other blockade, but you can kind of play around with it however you'd like. You can basically do an approach where you basically drain your Magicka all the way down to about 20% and then start heavy attacking. You can basically do 3 heavy attacks every time you lay down blockade, so 1, 2, 3, and then you can reapply Blockade and Spear. So you can kind of go that route and just do 3 heavy attacks when you start to run particularly low on Magicka, but I like to take the safer route, which is basically do a heavy attack every now and then, basically every other blockade, in order to maintain my Magicka. And then again, this is a kind of dynamic rotation, so you are going to have to keep an eye on your buff trackers like Strendar, Action Duration Reminder, to make sure you're getting your Vampire's Bane up. So I'm actually going to do a little bit of a switcheroo here. I'm actually going to put Raging Depression on the back bar and put my shield on the front bar here, just so you guys can get an idea of what it looks like if you decide to put your shield on your front bar instead of your back bar, because some people like to have their shield on their front bar. So let's go ahead and start our 6mm parse. I will try to narrate this throughout the parse so you guys can get an idea of what's going on through my head as I'm doing this parse. So this is the third blockade, so this is generally when from now on I'm going to do it every other blockade. So that's the first blockade. And then this is when I heavy attack. I basically queue up channeled focus. So every other blockade fits very well with the channeled focus. Because basically when I heavy attack is when it basically starts to disappear. So that way I will always have my buff up from channeled focus. Then heavy attack here. Again, another heavy attack. You can see here that the sustain is generally a little bit better compared to on the Sork, where we're pretty much have worse sustain overall. Well, that's really helping out our DPS. Now, there is a little bit of contention as to when you start to execute, basically when you want to start using Radiant Oppression. I like to do it around 20%. And then some people like to keep up Purifying Light. I, on the other hand, prefer just maintaining Blockade and Spear, but I can go with maintaining Purifying Light as well in the rotation if you'd like. But I like to just use I just like to use my execute and just maintain Blockade and Spear. This makes it a little bit simpler. Alright, so there we have it. That is our Magplar, ranged Magplar. So this is a dummy parse, so you're not really going to be able to get an accurate representation of what you'd be able to pull in an actual trial, but this will kind of get you an idea of where it stands compared to other Magicka DPS. Take a look at our combat metrics here. Pulled 33k, 33.1k here, which is pretty respectable. So light attacks make up a good portion of our DPS. Light attacks should be making up 100%, or not 100%, the number one source of your DPS here. You can see it's a clear 6% higher from the next highest source of damage. So Blockade is typically going to be up here, number 2 or number 1, depending on when you start execute. Some people like to start execute at 30%, some people like to start at 25%. I like to start at 20%, so you can start 25 or 20. That's generally the accepted range there, because Radiant Destruction is still not calculating damage correctly. You can see here max hit was only just shy of 36k when it should be hitting for much higher, but that's a discussion for another time. And again, when you are using your execute, some people like to use include Purifying Light because it does do a pretty nice amount of damage here. It doesn't crit though, so that's kind of the downside, so some people don't like to use Purifying Light. Then you can see here Zaan and Burning both do a significant amount of DPS here. And Blazing Spear is kind of down here, Burning Light's over here. This is kind of the first hit, I believe, from Vampire's Bane, and a dot is this one here. So you can see here, this is kind of how I take apart a combat metrics parse. You can see we got 62% uptime on the weapon damage enchant, which is quite nice. And another thing, look at our regen versus drain per second. The disparity there, it's pretty nice. It's a pretty small gap, which is what we want. So we can see here this is about a 58% ish difference, which is not that terrible. It's a lot easier to sustain this rotation compared to a Magicka Sorc, which is why our DPS is relatively high, higher than what you would expect to see. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.